Hey Growing Zone kids, it's Pastor Jason, and let's go through another couple questions from the New City Catechism for Kids. This week we're on question number 14, and it's this. Did God create us unable to keep His law? And the answer is no, but since the disobedience of Adam and Eve, we are all born in sin and guilt and unable to keep God's law. Well, last week we talked about God's law is like a target, and that target is like a really small target that's really far away, and it's impossible to hit. And so it's impossible for anybody to keep God's law. But the question is, well, was that mean of God to make a target that we can't hit? To make a law that we can't possibly fully obey? In fact, did God make humans unable to keep His law? This question teaches us that no, God didn't make us unable to. Remember when God made Adam and Eve way back at the beginning of creation? He created them in the garden with the ability to keep His law, but they made a choice not to. You see, when they did that, instead of trusting in that God's laws were good for them, instead of trusting that God knew what was best for them and obeying Him, they decided they were going to disobey and make their own rules. And when they did that, something really, really bad happened. Sin came into the world. See, disobeying God, doing the things that God tells us not to, or not doing the things that God tells us to do, that's called sin. And sin separates us from God. If you remember the story of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, their punishment for sin was to leave the garden. And it wasn't just that they were leaving a beautiful garden with everything they needed, but they were leaving the presence of God. See, before they sinned, God walked with Adam and Eve, but after they sinned, they had to leave the garden and they no longer walked with God. And this sin that caused them to be separated from God was given to their kids, and it was given to their kids, and then their kids gave it to their kids, and eventually every human being we were passed down the guilt of sin, which means that every human being has sin, and we're all separated from God. And now, because every human being has sin in our hearts, it makes it so that we are unable today to obey God's law fully. Even when we want to, we're not able to fully obey God. We can't hit that target perfectly every time. Then today, that's right, we cannot hit God's target. Now you might be thinking, well, if nobody can hit God's target, if nobody can obey God's law, then why would God give us a law that we can't keep? And that's a really good question. What's the point of the law if we can't keep it? Well, the next catechism question answers that for us. Question 15 is this: since no one can keep God's law, what is its purpose? And the answer is that we may know the holy nature of God and the sinful nature of our hearts, and thus our need for a Savior. Let me try to explain what that means. Well, when we look at God's law, and remember how we talked about last week how God's law shows us a little bit about God, and we use the word holiness. God's law shows us that God is perfect. And when we recognize that, when we realize that God is perfect, it causes us to look at our own hearts, and it causes us to realize that we're not perfect. God is holy, but we're not holy. And that's a big problem for us, because the Bible tells us that nobody who's not perfect, nobody who's not holy can be in the presence of God. You and I, because we're unholy as we are, we cannot be with God one day. That's bad news. So you see this problem? If we don't get this fixed, then nobody's going to be able to be with God one day. What we need is a Savior. We need someone to save us from ourselves, to save us from our sin. And that Savior can't be like one of us, because we're all sinners. No, we need a Savior who's perfect. We need somebody who has fully obeyed God's law to save us. Well, guess what? God has a plan. In fact, God had a plan from the very beginning. He knew we were going to sin. He knows that everybody sins against Him at one time or another. And God had a plan. And the plan all along was to send Jesus. You see, Jesus did obey God fully. Jesus never disobeyed God, and He hit God's target every single time. And not only has Jesus been perfect, but Jesus can give us His perfection. Jesus is our Savior from sin. You see, when He died, He took our sin on Him when He died on the cross. And when He was raised to life again, He gives us a promise that if anybody and everybody who believes in Jesus, then He will take their sin away. And this is good news, because do you remember what sin does? Sin separates us from God. So, if we trust in Jesus and Jesus takes our sin away, then we are no longer separated from God, and we have the promise from God that we'll be with him one day forever and ever and ever. Thanks to Jesus who takes our sin away, we can be with him forever and ever one day. Now that is good news.